Whitey Bulger's running partner, Catherine Greig, is already serving 8 years for helping him stay on the run for nearly 16. 9 months were added when she was found in civil contempt for refusing to tell the government who helped them stay free, and new charges of criminal contempt could add more years to her time in jail. We've convened a rather impressive caucus to talk about this and other legal controversies. Nancy Gertner is a former federal judge and currently a Harvard law professor who apparently is being stalked by a renegade cockatoo living in her neighborhood. I read that in the Globe, must be true. Donald Stern is a former U.S. attorney for the District of Massachusetts, and the man who succeeded him in that position would be Michael Sullivan. Gentlemen and lady, it's great to see all three of you. So the woman who holds the job that you held is bringing these charges here. It seems to me if she gets her way and Greig is found guilty of criminal contempt, she could serve more time in jail than a Bulger ally who killed 20 people and is now collecting Social Security in Cambridge. John Matarano, is there not something wrong with this picture?
Well, I think when you describe it that way, there appears to be something wrong with this picture.
Is that not a fair description?
Well, I'm not so sure it's fair. Obviously, I think the government does have a continuing interest to determine whether or not other people aided and abetted Whitey Bulger during the period of his fugitive status. And she has the opportunity to prevent herself from being held in criminal contempt.
You in the same place he is?
I am. And and it's hard to compare one case to the other.
Of course it is.
I understand when you look back, there's an element of unfairness, or so it seems. But there's one critical difference. John Matarano, at the end of the day, cooperated and told the truth, and the jury believed him.
20 people.
I understand that, Jim. But the thing that you need to understand, and I think the public may not fully understand, is that the government had zero evidence that he had killed anybody until the plea agreement was signed. And it was because of his cooperation and his truthful testimony that Bulger and Fleming are in prison for the rest of their life. But for that cooperation, but for that plea agreement, they would still be walking the streets.
Judge, is there unanimity or no?
No,
here?
not at all. Not at all. I think that it's completely excessive. She was charged with underlying crime and then civil contempt. Civil contempt means that you're in prison. You're in prison until you testify, and you're in prison until you get to the point that it's futile to go any further.
Which is what happened after 9 months. Yeah.
Right. So, in other words, the civil contempt is the hook to get you to testify. That obviously was not going to work. This is obviously not going to work. I think it's gratuitous. I think that it's clear that she's not going to deliver anything more. And yes, I know that it's important that people cooperate. There's no question. But there is, at the end of the day, a proportionality question. At the end of the day, you have to say, yes, the government got this benefit from Matarano, and that has to be the measure by which you look at her.
How about the thing the judge raises? If she didn't say anything for 9 months and she knew for every day she refused, she was going to serve a day in jail, and finally they gave up. Isn't that a legitimate point? What's the point of criminal contempt? She's going to continue not to answer the question. She says she doesn't have any information. But isn't that obvious? And doesn't it make it prosecutorial overkill, that fact alone, Don Stern?
Well, I don't know if it's obvious. I mean, as Mike knows quite well, the government may have some information which we don't have sitting here about whether this may be a tipping point that may result in cooperation. I don't particularly think so. But the purpose of criminal contempt is to punish the fact that she, notwithstanding the fact, I assume she was given immunity to testify,
right,
that she had no legal reason not to provide, as every citizen does, truthful information about potential crimes that have been committed. Is it over the top? When I was U.S. Attorney, we probably criminally prosecuted for contempt, I'd say probably a half a dozen people who had refused to testify before the Bulger grand jury. And believe it or not, some of those people would not testify. Once they were convicted of criminal contempt and once they were sentenced, they changed their mind.
But
all 6 of them?
I don't know about all 6, but some
this is the girlfriend.
Yeah.
I mean, we know that girlfriends don't testify against boyfriends regularly. We know that this is not going to go anywhere. And it seems to me a complete waste of resources and a way, candidly, of keeping the story in the press when it shouldn't be.
Well, who wants to keep in the press? Carmen Ortiz?
Yes.
Why?
Because it basically helps her look better. And I mean, he was a real criminal and she was after him.
Let's talk about, someone mentioned resources a minute ago. Let's talk about resources in other context. The big debate locally, nationally over mandatory minimum sentences, strict specific penalties for certain kinds of crimes. Conventional wisdom is most prosecutors love it, most judges hate it. Conventional wisdom apply to you?
Yes. I think mandatory minimum sentence has been very effective.
How so?
Well, you've seen as minimum mandatory sentences came into place and these notorious criminals started serving long prison sentences, you saw essentially crime rates go down.
Brennan Center for Justice says the crime rate has gone down zero
Well,
since.
it is now, but there's been an erosion with regards to minimum mandatory sentencing. And when you look at those people that ultimately go to prison under minimum mandatory sentence, most of them have a long criminal record where judges have spared them in terms of prison sentence. We looked at this when I was a district attorney in terms of minimum mandatory in Massachusetts. We found the average offender that went to state prison as a result of a minimum mandatory drug sentence, a drug trafficker, had over 24 criminal arrests and over 12 criminal convictions already on their record.
I hope you're going to agree with him only because I heard we're supposed to be going to the White House tomorrow to meet with the president about over-incarceration.
I'd much rather be here, Jim.
So you can't really agree with him.
No, I
can
don't.
you?
I fundamentally disagree. Look, I think mandatory minimums as a principle is not good or bad in the abstract. We've gone, excuse me, much too far. Much too far. We have, I think, 5% of the world's population, 25% of the people incarcerated around the world. We spend $80 billion on prisons. It's overkill. And one of the things that this group that's been put together by the Brennan, with the help of the Brennan Center, I'm one of 130 current police chiefs, current state prosecutors, and former federal U.S. attorneys who have come together to say, enough is enough. We have to recalibrate how we use sentencing.
Mandatory minimum sentences, seems to me, the basic premise is we don't trust you. Is that not the bottom line
That's
here?
what it started at, right. There was no question about that. But, you know, I'm actually writing a book about the people that I sentenced to terms which I believe to be completely disproportionate. It is not true, at least in my own practice, my own judgeship, that we were sentencing the worst of the worst. It wasn't true. The police would sit on the corner and wait till the quantities that this poor schlep was dealing reached a certain level that triggered the mandatory minimum, and then I would have to sentence at the mandatory minimum. And in addition, yes, there were people with criminal records, but we know that criminal records are to a degree a function of where you live. So it led to disparities down the line.
But quickly, even for those who buy your argument, it seems that in the public sphere, we're going to the opposite extreme. Should we be incarcerating people particularly with these kinds of drug crimes? No, now we should treat them. Do we have the resources, the beds, the facilities to do the other extreme? We don't, do we?
I agree with you in terms of the extremes. You know, I'm old enough to remember what it was like before mandatory minimums, and there, you know, rehabilitation was often a hope without any reality to it. We cannot cure everyone, but we do know what works in many cases. We have much more data. So the idea now would be to titrate sentences to be able to identify those for whom programs would work and those for whom it wouldn't. We'll still have appellate review of sentencing, so if a judge goes off the rails, we'll be able to deal with that. And we'll be able to redress some of the, I mean, I have horrible stories to tell where anybody, where I would sentence somebody and everyone in the room knew it was preposterous.
We only have a minute left. I'd love to hear this, but I want to get to this. Last night we had Debbie DeMacy here. She's the wife of former House Speaker Sal DeMacy on the program. He's serving an 8-year prison sentence on federal corruption charges, battling 2 forms of cancer. Listen to what Debbie DeMacy had to say about his condition.
Physically, he's the same. He's very thin. Swallowing continues to be an issue. Every 3 months he goes in and gets his esophagus dilated. Mentally, I think he's incredibly strong, but it's also, I think, very difficult for him. And I know he's very concerned about his cancer, and I know he's very concerned about this prostate cancer.
We only have a minute left. She went on to say he thinks he's going to die in jail. Should he be granted compassionate release?
Well,
you served with him, didn't you?
I did serve with...
Should he be granted compassionate release?
I think based on what was just represented on the screen without knowing more, I'd say yes. I mean, he's a nonviolent offender.
How about it, John? He served 4 years so far.
Yeah, I don't know the facts well enough and know his condition well enough, but the concept of expanding the category of people who should get compassionate release, I agree with.
How about you, Judge?
I absolutely do, and I'm actually involved in investigating his case
You
for
are?
the family. That's right.
And are you part of the compassionate release petition? Debbie DeMacy didn't want to speak about it last night. Are you?
I'm working on it. Yes, and he meets every standard. He meets every standard, and by no account should he continue to be in prison.
Time's up. Judge Gertner, it's good to see you. Gentlemen, it's great to see you as well.
Okay,
Thank you
thanks,
so
Jim.
much for your
Thanks,
time.
Jim.
We'll hope to see you again soon.